Now for something a little more relaxed. How about a new Yoshi game on Nintendo Switch? It's Yoshi's Crafted World. And at this point you might be thinking, what the heck makes this interesting for Digital Foundry, John? Well, I'm glad you asked, because there are some interesting things going on in this game from a technical and design standpoint, in fact. Namely, this is one of the very first Nintendo published titles to have been developed using Unreal Engine 4. It's also a game designed to target higher frame rates, and pre-release footage hasn't always been entirely smooth. So how does it hold up when actually playing the game, and did developer Goodfeel manage to reach its frame rate objectives? Well, that's exactly what we're here to find out. So for this video, we'll be looking at both the publicly available demo and an expanded version of the demo with some additional stages. So let's get started. It's not something I ever imagined coming to fruition, but here we are. Nintendo is publishing a game powered by Unreal Engine 4. To me at least, this is an interesting turn of events, and it demonstrates how successful Epic has been in supporting developers worldwide. After all, when it comes to Nintendo and the various developers working directly for the big N, studios typically seem to roll their own technology. So to think that this engine would be selected for a colorful 60 FPS Nintendo platformer is surprising, yet here it is. Following in the footsteps of its yarn-themed games, Yoshi's Crafted World relies on everyday objects and materials used to build its stages. Well, even more so than its previous games, since that's always been a theme here. Kirby's Epic Yarn, for instance, kicked off this phase, and the studio has continued along these lines, and I feel Crafted World is a nice continuation of this stylized approach. What I like about the visuals here is how they've managed to integrate some of Unreal's best features into the mix, such as what appears to be an offline approach to global illumination, which means that light bounce can be observed in certain scenes. Notice how the color of the room is influenced by the materials it's made of. This, plus the materials created by the game's artists, result in something that feels almost tangible at points. Modern rendering and materials are a perfect fit for a game like this, which tries to simulate such real-world objects. It's very effective, and it works great. The game also makes use of an aggressive depth of field effect designed to lend the action a tilt-shift-like appearance. The result is a tiny diorama of sorts with little figurines running around the world. You can even swish the camera from one side to the other in certain instances, which is a cool touch. It's nifty and almost reminds me of Little Big Planet in some ways, but more polished and obviously less ambitious, since this is a straightforward platforming game. Of course, that's not the only game that Crafted World reminds me of. You see, one of the cool features here is this path system. You can move in and out of the world based on defined paths, while aiming your eggs within a pseudo 3D space. So while it's still a 2D platformer on paper, there are sections of each stage which have multiple paths within the Z-axis. You can never roam freely, mind you, at least in the demo stages, but it does allow for some clever level design tricks. And we've seen it before. So the first thing that came to mind then was Bug for the Sega Saturn. Oh, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a huge fan of Bug or anything, but I've always found the concept fascinating. And it's cool to see it implemented here. It's still a 2D platformer, but you can move on the X, Y, and Z axis. I guess you could say that Nintendo does what Sega used to, or something. So yes, overall it's an attractive little game with a unique sense of style, but it's also clear that there were some sacrifices made to hit the target frame rate. And as you might expect, rendering resolution is perhaps the most noticeable thing here. Yoshi's Crafted World appears to employ a dynamic resolution feature which sees pixel counts vary heavily during gameplay. Okay, maybe not heavily. In general, it seems like the game averages around 576p when docked, but we noted some pixel counts above this, including 1152 by 675, so it's not entirely limited. The pixel steps are always obvious though, so it doesn't seem like they're using any of the advanced anti-aliasing features of Unreal Engine here, but it still looks clean enough. Heck, it's even possible in the right situation the game may reach 720p, I just haven't seen it in the demo. Now if we jump over to portable mode then, the resolution drops further with a range that seems to hang between 704 by 396 and 880 by 495 or so. Again, it's dynamic and it could go both above and below these values, but that's where it tends to hang most of the time, and yeah, it does look rather blurry on the portable screen. Now, as I noted, the game is still reasonably clean, but it's obvious that resolution had to be sacrificed and image quality isn't exceptional. It's blurry both in docked and handheld modes. This kind of applies directly to other visual elements as well in the rendering pipeline. The ever-present depth of field, for instance, is clearly reduced in resolution, as is ambient occlusion. Basically, the developers seemingly had to reduce many rendering features to reach the performance target, and honestly, I feel they made the right choice here. And that becomes much more clear when you actually look at the performance. So when docked, I went ahead and benchmarked the entirety of the demo level just to see how it holds up. The target is 60 frames per second, which is not a trivial thing to reach in an Unreal Engine 4 game on the Switch, I'd imagine, but Goodfeel has pulled it off. The stage holds 60 frames per second 99% of the time. It's very stable, it's very smooth, and it runs like a dream. There are just a couple minor frame time skips here and there along the way, but other than that, it's locked down at the target. This is most evident when turning the camera around to look at the other side of the stage, which, by the way, features a really slick motion blur effect. Now, while the gameplay itself is very stable, I was a little surprised by the half-rate menu and overworld. But then again, we've seen this before in their previous Yoshi games, so I guess we shouldn't be too surprised. Basically, these areas are 30 frames per second. Not a big deal, honestly, since there isn't a lot of gameplay happening here, but it feels kind of jarring when you come from the game to the map screen. Now, portable mode also aims for 60 frames per second, and it gets there without issue. The entire stage reaches the 60 FPS target with just a couple minor skips once again, just as we saw when playing in docked mode, but otherwise it's very smooth. And this is precisely why Crafted World is so darn impressive. The fact is, having spoken with various Unreal developers working on Switch and testing a lot of games using the engine myself, there is a sense that reaching such a stable 60 frames per second with this engine on Switch is a huge accomplishment. The CPU, for instance, is a real bottleneck here, but somehow the developers have overcome it. Yoshi is a small-scale game, I suppose, but I don't think that would be enough on its own. And on top of the smooth performance, the game also loads very quickly and features responsive controls, both of which could have been potential issues here, but no, it works great. Of course, this move to Unreal also means that it will likely remain on the Switch. Goodfeel did manage to bring over some of its previous games to the Nintendo 3DS after all, and Nintendo itself ported over titles like Captain Toad Treasure Tracker. I think that's super cool personally, even if people aren't excited by new 3DS releases, but due to the use of Unreal Engine, I don't think we're going to see that happen this time. And that shift to Unreal is an interesting thing to think about. I would not expect this to become a standard thing within Nintendo or anything, but it really works here, and it seems that Goodfeel has a great handle on its technology. And hey, even Nintendo has to rely on rendering tricks like dynamic resolution to target those high frame rates, and heck, the portable solution for Super Mario Odyssey was especially interesting. Honestly, it's shaping up to be a great little game, and one I think I'll enjoy playing, at least for the most part. I say that because there's one big flaw, at least for me personally, and bear with me on this one. It's the soundtrack. The music in this game is just awful to the point where it drags down the overall experience. For me, a great soundtrack is absolutely critical for a platform game, and Yoshi's Crafted World just misses the mark, which is something that's become rather common in a lot of these Yoshi games post the original Yoshi's Island. Now, the soundtrack isn't aggressively awful, such as it was in Yoshi's New Island or anything, but it's just so dull and grating. This was kind of my problem with New Super Mario Bros., and it's even worse here. It's a shame we never got back to the catchy yet atmospheric tunes that you could sometimes get in the original Yoshi's Island on Super NES. I mean, just listen to this. And of course, beyond the soundtrack itself, the original Yoshi's Island really does look amazing, and it pushes the Super NES to its absolute limits. It's one of the best examples of using the Super FX chip on the system, absolutely. And I suppose that time-honored tradition of pushing limits of hardware kind of carries on with Yoshi's Crafted World here on the Switch. It's a beautiful and smooth-running game. I'll certainly be curious to see if the final game pushes the system further with more complex level design. Either way, despite the soundtrack, I do plan to keep an eye out for this one in the future. In terms of mechanics, it's the most enjoyable Yoshi game I think I've played since the original Yoshi's Island. I don't expect it to match that classic, mind you, but it's clear that Goodfeel has made huge steps here. This could be its best game yet, and it also demonstrates that they have some serious technical chops. The development team has managed to utilize Unreal Engine beautifully on Nintendo Switch, and the performance is shaping up to be, well, just about perfect. But that's all for now though. If you enjoyed this calm, cool little video about Yoshi's Crafted World, be sure to let me know by doing all the typical YouTube stuff that we all love. Like, subscribing to the channel, ringing those notification bells, following us over on Twitter, and all that good stuff. But until next time, this is John signing off.